The market has calmed down a lot and prices are stabilizing, with Radeon cards back to being cheap as ever. So join us today as we take a look at this 6-year wonder of a card. This right here is the Radeon HD7870, namely the MSI edition one, but the majority of 7000 series cards all come with great cooling, so it doesn't really matter what one you get. Based on the Pitcairn XT variant of the GCN architecture, it was the bigger brother to the HD7850, which featured fewer shading units than this one, clocking in at 1280 shading units on this model here, with core clocks coming in on all models around the 1GHz mark, hence the name 1GHz edition on a lot of them. Realistically, they all clock above or around this mark, so that's not too much to worry about. 2GB of GDDR5 VRAM is also included, and clocks in at a pleasant 1200 MHz, which can really help out with some of those bandwidth limited applications, and it costs around £35 to £40, which is one of the main reasons we're taking a look at it. It can be found on most markets for a similar price to that, so generally around the $35 to $40 region as well. It's one of the cards I end up being asked about a lot given the recent price drops and the fact it's so common, even if it is under the other name of the R7 which generally performs very similarly to this, as despite having released 6 years ago, it does still get all the latest driver updates from AMD, which means support for even the most modern of titles released nowadays. But before we find out more about that, how about we give it a bit of a cleanup? Now, generally if you get one of these cards, it's suffice to say they will need a bit of a cleanup and some fresh thermal paste, but they're really easy to clean and none of the coolers are all too complicated, generally just needing 4 screws, and it takes all of 2 minutes to actually get it done. But as I was saying, these cards have all the latest optimizations, bug fixes, and even customization options provided by the latest AMD drivers, with the only exception being AMD Wattman, but even then you still have an older version of this, which allows you to overclock your card from within the drivers. Something we won't actually be messing around with here, as we just want to see the stock performance that generally most of you will be able to see, as the card was a budget offering all that time ago. And it was a good one too, costing the same as a GTX 660 over here, but outperforming it in many of the titles of the time, and it was fully up to date with the latest APIs, which meant that it's pull ahead quite a bit over the Kepler cards in titles that were released today. As of course, the card does support DirectX 12 and Vulkan, something that can be a bit of an issue when you're looking on the used market. Many people are hailing it nowadays as the poor man's alternative to a GTX 1050, as it supports all the latest APIs the same as that, has very similar gaming performance, and is actually over 2 times cheaper than a GTX 1050. But it does have a rather high TDP, so you will need just a beefy enough power supply to power it. But generally I've seen this thing running on 400 watt FSP units and stuff like that, so as long as it's a high quality power supply you don't have to worry too much about that. But let's get this thing put back together and see how this transforms into real world gaming performance in 2018. Firstly, we have the likes of PUBG, which is a highly Nvidia favoured game, but even so I wouldn't exactly say our performance was bad at all, with the HD7870 coming in with 56 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 42 FPS, and 0.1% lows only achieved when we were parachuting down and the game was loading in a lot of the textures. This was all with a mixture of medium settings, with a few of the options like view distance set to high, and overall it was quite playable. The game was pegged at 100% utilization, and it did cause our fans to ramp up slightly, but even then the card remained alright. Even in combat our frame rate was stable, and you could definitely lower a few more of those settings if you wanted to achieve well over 60 FPS, as a lot of people do prefer to target those higher frame rates. Up next we have the likes of Fortnite, as it is still one of the most popular games out there today, which did run much better than PUBG in terms of frame times, not that that was bad by any means. Despite being a highly Nvidia favouring game, we saw frame rates on average of 56 FPS while using the medium and high settings in the 1080p resolution, and this was a fairly stable experience with the frame time shown, so it didn't matter whether you're in combat or just messing around, you definitely had a competitive experience. Something quite remarkable for a card on the cheaper side of the market, especially with the settings this high. Next up, we had the likes of CSGO, which is another one of the largest competitive titles out there still, so we decided to try it using the benchmark map to get an accurate idea of what the game looks like when running under the highest load possible. And even so, we saw 273 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 54 FPS and 0.1% lows down to 49 FPS. These of course being from the high amount of smoke that the benchmark throws in your way, so experiencing results like this is actually somewhat impressive. The game does run fine in higher settings, and in competitive play you'll never actually see frame rates this low, but it's just to get an idea of how the game runs with this type of benchmark. Forza 7 makes for a good benchmark in terms of how well it utilises the DirectX 12 API and how intensive of a game it can be. So it's a good test to see how future games might perform on a card like this when they're using an API like DirectX 12 or Vulkan, and in which we saw 59 FPS on average, with frame times that actually hardly budge from this mark. But this is partially due to the game allowing you to set a target frame rate. In this case I chose 60 FPS, and then the game chooses dynamic settings around what you want as a baseline, so I chose medium, and well, it worked great, and you can hardly notice any subtle changes to the game while it's actually running. The game was a bit of a pain in the arse to record, so you'll have to excuse the 30 FPS capture and the lack of a Riva tuner overlay, as it is still a bit temperamental with some DirectX 12 titles, but generally it was a very nice experience on a card like this. Hitman, while running in 1080p with a mixture of medium and high settings while utilising the DirectX 12 renderer, works spectacularly well with an average of 50 FPS. And I'll be honest, in games like this, I do actually enjoy the detailed shadow work and environments, so I did crank up quite a few of those settings. But if you prefer to swap around some of those settings and actually opt for lower versions, you could hit a rock solid 60 FPS for the majority of the time. I was probably playing as detectable as possible, engaging in gunfights, getting in combat, but generally if you play quite stealthily, your frame times may even look better than the ones shown here. Battlefield 1 was just using the default high preset with DirectX 11, as DirectX 12 is horribly implemented in a game like this with the 1080p resolution, and the game did look great and worked very similar to this in both multiplayer and single player. I would add that the game looked very smooth with the frame time shown, and it was very rarely differing from the 50 to 60 FPS region most of the time. It's a very playable experience aside from a few loading hitches and when the level had first loaded, but aside from that it was smooth sailing. Similar cases to this also include the likes of older titles like the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim Special Edition, which work perfectly fine in the 1080p resolution, something that I've said quite a lot in this video. You get the idea, it's a very good 1080p gaming card, and you have to admire how fluent the frame rate is in games like this, especially considering how new the revamp is. There could be a few minor frame time issues, but these were mainly when you first got outside and there were plenty of people standing around. Lowering the settings would achieve a solid 60 FPS inside and outside, as I was using the preset high options, but generally I personally had no problems with the way the game was running. The same holds true for Fallout 4, utilising the exact same settings and resolution as Skyrim, and the game stuck to a solid 60 FPS when inside and adventuring around the wastes, but would drop slightly below this when we were in intensive combat, to the 40 to 50 FPS region generally. It wasn't too bad, but I would prefer to see a locked 60 FPS, which you could get by turning down the settings, but generally with games like this it can be a little bit temperamental, and it's a bit hard to benchmark depending on the situations. So if you're in combat, expect around 40 to 50 FPS, but if you're around the wastes and doing anything like that, you can expect a solid and locked 60 FPS. Finally on our list of titles we have the likes of GTA 5, which is something you can't really escape as a benchmark. To give an idea, in 1080p with the very high settings used, we saw around 58 FPS on average, which is sort of to be expected with most games of this era, which you can virtually max out and run absolutely fine on a card like this. Realistically, this is the reason people bought these cards, because at the time it could absolutely max out the games, and the same sort of holds true with the games a few years later like Skyrim and Fallout, which we were running with the high settings. Synthetically, in a test like 3D Mark's Time Spy, which is usually my favourite one to actually compare GPU results nowadays, we saw an average of 1702, which isn't a bad score at all, and is around what a standard clocked GTX1050 would come at as well, mainly due to how well the HD7070 series holds up and can utilise the likes of DirectX 12, which of course means that we get a relatively high score for a card that is this old. Of course, overclocking can make this go up, which holds true for both cards, but it practically shows that the card doesn't have any signs of slowing down just yet, and it'd be ideally paired with a 1155 Core i5 series CPU like an i5-2400, which only only costs around £25, so you get an idea it's not hard to buy a nice CPU pairing for a GPU like this. So in conclusion, the HD7870, it's just one of those GPUs that doesn't bother me to use. It's just a pleasant graphics card. You put it in your system, you download the latest drivers, and you're officially ready to go. All the games you throw at it generally will run absolutely fine, even if you do have to turn up down a few of the high-end options on newer titles, but generally it was absolutely fine. I mean, any games I threw at it, whether they were benchmarked or not, were just decent to use. It was so good I just ended up using it till this video was pretty much complete. You have AMD Relive, so you can also use video encoding, which is also known as AMD's VCE, which works well and you can record your gameplay. It's ideal for 1080p 60fps capture on a card this old, but generally you can also increase the speed of some of your exports if they are VCE enabled applications. It's a good card, it's a cheap card, and it gets the bloody job done. I mean, I can't recommend it enough for those reasons. The last card I actually had the same idea about was the GTX1050, but realistically, this is much more common, it's newer, and it has more features while consuming less power and performing slightly better. So generally, I'd just go for whatever's cheaper. If you find a GTX570 cheap, go for that. If you just find a HD7870 or R7 well, it's going to be your best bet for mid-range gaming in 2018, I reckon. So thank you very much for watching, good night. One final thing I would say before I go is that I've just recently featured in a collab with Henry from Computer Cat Gaming, and he's just made a brilliant 40-minute long documentary with a load of us featuring in it, so I recommend checking that out and I've linked it down below. You can always like and subscribe for more or dislike if you don't want to.